Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today we're going to be diving into the topic of Calvinism, specifically the use and misuse of analogies in arguments against Calvinism. So, analogies are frequently employed by various critics to argue against Calvinism's understanding of what we call divine determinism, issues like human responsibility and God's righteousness. And some of the most common analogies include things that if you're in these debates, you're going to recognize, right? That if divine determinism in the Calvinistic sense is true, then that makes human beings like pets or puppets. God coerces us to do things. He manipulates us. And then there are moral objections, such as the claim that Calvinism makes God the author of sin, or Calvinism makes God, an evil manipulator, because they hold to this view of, divine determinism and these sorts of things. But my question that I'm going to be asking today is how effective are these analogies, right? Do they actually challenge Calvinism in a meaningful way, or do they, at the end fail because of significant relevant differences between the analogies and the Calvinist position? So that's what we're going to be covering in this video today. I want to kind of highlight this first at the very beginning, is that this topic is hotly debated, and there are a lot of people who, deathly disagree with each other. I'm not claiming that this video is going to be the end all be all. All I can do in the nature of these debates is to share my perspective, and hopefully it is useful for folks who are engaging in these topics. And there you go. So that's all we can possibly do. Obviously, and it doesn't help either to say, well, if determinism is true, then God has determined me to not be a Calvinist. Well, yeah, that's not a meaningful response to someone who holds to divine determinism in the Calvinistic sense. That's just a statement of the determinist position. But because we do not know the nature of God's divine decree, it may be the case that God uses this video or another Calvinist to persuade you that Calvinism is true, or that there is no logical problem between the notion that God determines all things, yet human beings are morally praiseworthy, blameworthy, responsible for their actions, or anything along those lines. So hopefully we can address issues that go beyond kind of the mere superficial treatment of these topics. Okay. And so hopefully this video will prove helpful to that end. So what are we covering in this video? The use and often misuse of analogies, okay, when arguing against Calvinism. Okay. Now, argument by analogy can be a very powerful tool in conveying a point that you're trying to make, or to show that a certain position is fallacious in some meaningful way, but they can be misused. Okay. So an argument by analogy, okay, just to put it simply, aims to show that two situations are sufficiently similar in some critical respect, right? And so what is true of one must be true of the other. And so in the context of Calvinism, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and when I use the term Calvinism, I'm specifically addressing the Calvinistic understanding of divine determinism, all right, or theological determinism, okay? The claim that is often put forth is that if a theological view shares, this is argument by analogy, it shares a key problematic feature with another case that we already reject, then we should reject the theological view as well, okay, when it's being used in terms of critiquing Calvinism. Now, what I found helpful, and I kind of learned this from my good friend Guillaume Bignon, who's been on this channel in the past. And so if I remember while I'm recording this video now, I'll try to remember to link my discussions with Guillaume. He is a analytic philosopher and far more well-versed on these issues than I am. And as a matter of fact, in my Epic Calvinism conference, his main talk was on this very topic. And folks could access that through Revealed Apologetics. If you go to Precept U and look up the Epic Calvinism conference, there is a talk that Guillaume gave on this very topic. Introducing All Access, your premium gateway to deeper apologetic and theological insights. Through Q&A sessions, theological lectures, and exclusive bonus content, All Access takes your learning to the next level. Support the ministry of Apologia Studios while unlocking incredible resources like Ask Me Anything, which is an interactive live stream featuring Jeff Durbin. We have the Academy featuring theological lectures from leading experts and exclusive content from shows like Apologia Radio and Cultish. With more exciting content on the way, there's never been a better time to join. Visit apologiastudios.com and click join to get started today. But what I found helpful in listening to him and reading his material is that he makes the distinction between two types of claims that analogies can make. Okay, analogies can make what he calls a mild claim. Okay, in other words, there is at least one relevant similarity between the analogy and the theological position in question. With respect to this topic, it's going to be Calvinism, right? But this alone doesn't prove the analogy is sound. And then there is the bold claim, right, which states that there is no relevant difference between the analogy and the theological position, meaning the problem in the analogy must also apply to Calvinism in this particular case. Okay, and so I think it's important to consider. Let me just turn my phone off just in case I get a phone call in the middle of this. We don't want that to happen, right? So many distractions when you're doing YouTube. But anyway, the key to refuting these analogies when they're used against the Calvinist position and the divine determinist position, right? All this jazz, right? We want to ask these two questions, okay? Where do they assume their conclusion? And I'll expand on this a bit because arguments against divine determinism, especially within kind of the philosophical interactions, there seems to be kind of a simply taking for granted a particular view. So you want to ask the question, where do they assume their conclusion, right? Many of these analogies beg the question by assuming that divine determinism entails the problem that they're trying to prove. Okay, so that's question number one. Question number two, are there relevant differences between the analogy and the Calvinist divine determinist position? Okay, if we can show that Calvinism differs in a significant way from the analogy, then the analogy is going to fail. And in that case, we will have successfully shown that the analogy does not accomplish what the person using the analogy is trying to accomplish. Okay, so a key issue, if I can kind of go off on a side note on this, the key issue in these discussions, I think, that often comes up is the issue of begging the question, which for those of you familiar with logic, right, this occurs when a person assumes what they're trying to prove, all right? And this often happens due to various issues. You have issues of equivocation in these discussions, right? When we use a term in a different sense without clarification, right? Or because a particular definition is simply assumed without argument. These sorts of things happen all the time in this discussion. I'm going to try my best not to do that. It's not easy to avoid these issues. So I'm not saying, what's wrong with you people? You got to make sure you define your terms clearly. I get that, but that's not always easy to do because of the nuanced nature of these discussions. And of course, you have the different levels of sophistication with respect to people who defend each of these positions. You have the debates between common lay persons that are not familiar with the background philosophical distinctions and discussions on this topic, in which the way they interact with each other will take on a particular flavor. And then you have the more scholarly, more careful, nuanced discussion between those who are very familiar with the technical terminology that is so often associated with debates on free will and determinism and compatibilism and all these sorts of things, right? Categorical abilities to do otherwise and conditional abilities to do otherwise. All of these things come into focus here when we are discussing these issues. But the issue of begging the question, giving you an example, when someone speaks of quote unquote true free will, or they ask whether humans are quote unquote truly free, all right, often what I've found is that they may be assuming already before even demonstrating it, a libertarian definition of free will. And, the idea that an agent must have the ability to choose otherwise in the exact same circumstances, which is also related to the categorical ability to do otherwise, which we will define. Okay, so you want to keep in mind libertarian free will, categorical abilities versus conditional abilities, the issue of incompatibilism, of which libertarian free will is related to that. Okay, so let's kind of define some terms, and I apologize if I forget to define some key terms. Because I'm assuming folks who are listening to this have somewhat of a background in these discussions. So let's take a look at something like incompatibilism, okay? Incompatibilism is the view that divine determinism and moral responsibility or moral praiseworthiness or blameworthiness are incompatible, right? Meaning that if God determines all things, humans cannot be morally responsible. They cannot be morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. And incompatibilism is often linked to libertarian free will, which is also connected to that categorical ability to do otherwise, right? The ability to do otherwise in the categorical sense will kind of define what that means in just a bit. And then you have the Calvinist position, okay? And when I say Calvinist position, I understand that there's a broad umbrella of people who hold to different understandings, but I come from the tradition and the perspective that compatibilism is the position that I think is defensible and is in line with coherent philosophical outlook and grounded in principles grounded in Scripture itself. So compatibilism is the view that divine determinism and moral responsibility are compatible. That is, humans can be responsible for their actions. They can be morally praiseworthy or blameworthy, even if their choices are determined by God's decree. And so, if an incompatibilist argues that Calvinism must be false because it denies true free will, but defines true free will in a libertarian sense, then they're begging the question, right? They're assuming their own view of freedom is the correct one before actually demonstrating it. And this is precisely what is under debate. Now, again, not everyone does this. Obviously, there are folks who do not simply assume their position, but have actually extensively argued for their position. Of course, I'm not, talking about those folks. And be careful too. Like the Calvinist just assumes such and such. Well, come on, let's have a little charity, right? I mean, Reformed theology has a very rich intellectual tradition. These issues have been well thought out throughout the history of Reformed, the development of Reformed theology, and some of the giants of the faith have been Reformed Christians who affirm, divine determinism. So that doesn't mean it's true, but we don't want to just simply say, oh, they're just assuming it. No, they're not just assuming it. They've argued for it, right? So we need to interact with the arguments, all right? And the same for the opposite, right? When someone who comes from a kind of an incompatibilist perspective or a libertarian free will perspective or a categorical ability to do otherwise perspective, we want to look for the arguments as well. But it is often the case that sometimes those categories are assumed without argument. Okay, so this issue of begging the question, right? So this is a classic example that often comes up in discussions that I have and that I've heard is the citation of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, which is sometimes used as a kind of a proof text for free will in the libertarian sense and this kind of categorical ability to do otherwise, all right? So what does 1 Corinthians 10:13 say? It says, no temptation, this is the Apostle Paul here, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Okay? Now, from this, one might claim, and they have claimed, and I've heard the claim multiple times, is that the Bible teaches libertarian free will because it says we have the ability to choose a way out of temptation. Okay. And at face value, I kind of see why someone would use this text. But again, this assumes that the ability to choose otherwise in this passage must be understood in that categorical sense rather than in what is often referred to as the conditional sense. And so when we talk about the ability to do otherwise, what often comes up in these debates is the difference between the categorical ability to do otherwise and the conditional ability to do otherwise. And this might seem kind of weird, but these terms like free will and the ability to do otherwise and all, there's a very nuanced background discussion that has been going on throughout history that we can't simply ignore and simply use terms assuming, well, they're just clear, right? This is what we mean by free will. And that's not necessarily the case. Okay. So what is the categorical ability to do otherwise? Okay. And why is it associated with a libertarian conception of freedom? Okay. The categorical ability to do otherwise means that in the exact same circumstances, with the same character, same desires, past events, all the causal conditions, a person could have chosen differently. Okay. And this is the standard kind of connection with kind of a libertarian conception of freedom. And then you have the conditional ability to do otherwise, which means that a person could have chosen differently if they had desired to do so. And so in other words, the ability to do otherwise depends on different conditions being in place, right? Such as a different set of desires or motivations or anything along those lines. And this is the compatibilist understanding. It's associated with the compatibilist understanding of free will and the ability to do otherwise. Okay. And so Coming back to kind of 1 Corinthians 10:13, the passage teaches that a person can resist temptation. Why? Well, in the passage it explicitly says because God provides a way of escape. Okay, and the Calvinist is obviously not going to reject that because that's clearly what the text says. But it doesn't say that a person must have the categorical ability to resist in precisely the same set of circumstances, right? Instead, it may be affirming a conditional ability, right? That if a person had the desire to take the escape route, they would have done so. But the key point that I'm getting here is not to say that it supports the conditional ability or the categorical ability, but to be careful not to simply assume a particular position when interpreting the scriptures, okay? The Bible affirms that people make real choices. The Calvinist does not deny that, okay? But it does not explicitly state whether those choices require a categorical or a conditional understanding of freedom and the ability to do otherwise. So when discussing free will, when you're discussing and debating determinism and moral responsibility with non-Calvinists, I think it's going to be essential to define our terms clearly and avoid, as best as possible, avoid smuggling in unwarranted assumptions, right? If a person assumes their view of freedom is the correct one without an argument, then they're not proving their case. They're simply begging the question, and you have to be able to kind of point that out in others and be careful not to commit those fallacious lines of reasoning yourself, right? Which again, is not always easy to do, especially when we're talking about such a nuanced topic as this. So to have a meaningful and productive discussion, we need to, one, as best as we can, clarify the terms that we're using to avoid equivocation, okay? We want to, two, ask for justification when someone assumes their view of freedom is the only valid one to hold, okay? And three, we want to be aware of question begging, especially when discussing certain biblical passages related to choice, to freedom, responsibility, and divine sovereignty. And I think by doing this, we go a long way in ensuring that our debates over free will, determinism, moral responsibility, they're not just exercises in talking past each other, right? But that they are genuine engagements with the issues. All right. So I think these are important. And again, I'm the kind of Calvinist that I don't try to be too hard on my non-Calvinist friends because these topics are super difficult. These issues are not simply straightforward, that they just leap off the page, right? The people have been grappling with these ideas for a very long time. And so I think we need to engage with, just like 1 Peter 3:15 says, right? Whether we're talking to the unbeliever or we're talking to believers, right? We need to engage with gentleness and respect. So obviously I know that there are people who disagree with me, and that's okay. That's all right. I don't hate you, right? But that's just the nature of the beast, right? But we want to engage in a respectful and meaningful fashion. Now, of course, I've done topics on Calvinism and people have challenged me. Well, why don't you debate this issue? And of course, a bunch of people claiming like, why don't you interact with this one? Hey, man, I'm only one person, right? Give me some credit. I've got a YouTube channel, and so I try to put my views out there so people can hear my views, but I'm unable to interact with everyone who demands that I respond to their comments and things like that. So I do apologize. I do try to read the comments if they're written out respectfully, especially people who are critics of Calvinism and divine determinism and all these sorts of things. I do take the objections very seriously, and so I am interested in folks sharing their view. And I have read up a bit on this topic. So while I'm not, the divine determinist guru philosopher, right? I am somewhat familiar with these views. And so I've tried to reason through them myself and have come to the conclusions I've come to, but I'm always open to meaningful interaction when I'm able to. All right. So nevertheless, let's take a look at some of these analogies, right? So when the Calvinist says that God determines everything, he decrees everything that comes to pass. Okay. Folks will say something like, the claim will be something like Calvinism, okay, which embedded in that is kind of like a divine determinism or a theological determinism or something along those lines. Calvinism makes humans like pets or puppets, okay, beings that are entirely controlled and not truly responsible for their actions, okay? And so here we want to identify the two kinds of claims that can be made within kind of this argument from analogy when people make this point. So we have the mild claim, okay, in terms of which the critic assumes that humans determined by God are analogous to puppets or pets. And then you have the more bold claim, right, that the critics insist there is no relevant difference between divine determinism and being a puppet. Okay, so those are the two, kind of a mild claim and bold claim. We'll try to do this to some of the other analogies as well, so you can kind of see the two claims that can be set forth in arguments by analogy with respect to critiquing, divine determinism, Calvinism, these sorts of things. Okay, and so what are we to make about this claim that Calvinism makes people pets, puppets, these sorts of things? Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. Well, I think the analogy fails because it assumes, or it seems to give the impression that being determined is identical to being non-conscious, non-rational, or merely mechanical, right? But again, this is obviously false from our perspective. There are two relevant differences here. One that comes to mind is the issue of consciousness and rationality, right? Puppets and pets lack rationality. They lack moral awareness and self-conscious agency, right? Humans, on the other hand, from a biblical perspective, are created in God's image, right? We are created with rational faculties, moral responsibility, which as a Calvinist I affirm, and we are created with volition, right? Calvinism doesn't teach that God mechanically controls human beings like puppets, but that his decree encompasses their freely chosen actions in accordance with their own character and their own desires, okay? A second relevant difference is wrapped up in the nature of divine determination. I think God's providential control works through human will and intellect, right? It doesn't override it like a puppet master, right? Scripture constantly affirms God's, I think it affirms God's meticulous sovereignty and human responsibility. They're not at odds with each other. And so equating Calvinism with a puppet analogy, I think is a misrepresentation to the Calvinist position. So in my estimation, if there is a good argument against divine determinism, I don't think it's found in the pets or puppets analogy. All right. And that's just one example that is typically used. There's also a category of analogies that refer to the issue of coercion. Okay. And so the claim will go something like this: Calvinism makes human actions coerced, like someone forced against their will to act in a certain way. And again, like the previous analogy of the mild claim and the bold claim. Okay. And so the mild claim here is something along the lines of being determined by God is similar to being coerced. Or you have the more bold claim that divine determinism and coercion have no relevant differences. Okay. Now, what are we to make of this? And again, I think this analogy doesn't work as well. Okay. I think it makes the mistake of, divine determinism. It's being equated with some kind of external coercion of some sort, which of course the Calvinist is going to take issue with. Okay. Again, there are two relevant differences here, I think. And the first relevant difference is the absence of force or threats. Coercion involves external force, right? It's an external force applying pressure against a person's desires or their will. You get the example of someone holding a gun to your head or forcing you to do something. But divine determinism doesn't function in that way, right? In Calvinism, people act according to their nature and their desires, right? God's sovereignty is not forceful compulsion. It's an effectual shaping of human wills without violating their voluntary action. I'm reminded of those debates that Dr. James White often has. He's like the libertarian critic often makes the picture look like God is putting a gun to your head and saying, do evil things, do bad things. That, of course, is not the Calvinist position, right? We just reject the assumptions underlying that type of critique. I think a second relevant difference is the issue of internal willingness. In coercion, people act against their will. But in Calvinism, people act according to their will, even though that will is determined by God, right? He's determined by God's decree. That's not a secret, by the way. The divine determinist will affirm that that the will is determined by God in the sense that God decrees all things, right? This is to point that out is just to affirm that we affirm divine determinism, which of course the compatibilist does. Okay, we do, but we think that is consistent or compatible with moral praiseworthiness, moral blameworthiness, and moral responsibility. Okay, so I think this is a huge distinction that I think invalidates the coercion analogy, right? Since Calvinism maintains that people act freely in accordance with their own desires, coercion just simply is not the correct category to apply here. And so I don't think it works. So I'll repeat my refrain. If there is a good analogy against divine determinism, okay, and Calvinism and all that jazz, this isn't one of them in my estimation, okay? But then you have another category of analogy that often comes up, and that's the manipulation analogies, right? And so the claim will come in the form of, the statement that Calvinism is like an evil scientist programming a person, right, to act in a certain way through some form of manipulation. Okay. And again, at this point, we're going to want to make the distinction between the mild claim that an argument by analogy like this can make and the bold claim that an argument by analogy like this can make. Okay. So the mild claim, right, is something along the lines of divine determinism is similar to psychological or external manipulation. And the bold claim could be something like there is no relevant difference between God's determination and human manipulation. Okay. And so this often comes up, but again, I think that there are relevant differences that make this analogy not a good one. Okay. For example, relevant difference number one. Okay. God is not, on Calvinism and divine determinism, God is not an external manipulator in that sense. Okay. In cases of manipulation, an external agent forces an individual to act contrary to their normal reasoning or desires, right? You have issues of brainwashing, drugging, love potions, these sorts of things, deceiving the person, right? But in contrast to that, God's determination works through a person's own character, through their own nature and their desires. And so there's no violation of their agency in that sense. A second relevant difference comes in, and I think that people mix this up all the time, and that is the mixing up of the creator-creature distinction, okay? Think about it. Unlike human manipulators who impose their will on another person, God as creator has the rightful authority to govern his creation, right? It's not unjust for God to order history according to his perfect will, okay? Oftentimes, people will confuse the creator-creature distinction by applying human categories to God and acting as though, they function at the same level, and they just don't. Okay. There are certain things that are true of God that are not true of human beings. Okay. If someone says, well, if I walked over there and I murdered someone, how is that any different than if God goes over there and takes someone's life? Again, you can't apply human categories that humans are subject to God. God has the right to take life because he's the author of life. You aren't, right? You function under a divine law. God is not under a higher law than himself. Okay, so you don't want to mix up creator-creature distinction. Another relevant difference is the issue of the moral character of God, right? Human manipulators often act deceptively or selfishly or sinfully, right? Whereas God acts righteously and justly by nature. That's how he is. That's his nature, right? And so the fact that he ordains events, including human choices, doesn't make him an immoral manipulator, okay? Because he always does things rightly and justly, even if we happen to disagree with how God happened to do that. All right. And so the manipulation analogies, I think, don't work either. Again, if there is a good analogy against the Calvinist determinist view, compatibilist, whatever, that's not a good one. I don't think, in my estimation. Okay. Then there's the analogy of mental illness. Okay. And so the claim goes something like this. Calvinism makes humans act like those suffering from severe mental illness, lacking moral responsibility. And again, we could disambiguate two claims, right? There's a mild claim and a bold claim here as well. So the mild claim could be something like the analogy assumes that determinism results in loss of moral awareness. And the bold claim can be something along the lines as saying that there is no relevant difference between a mentally ill person and a divinely determined person. Okay. But again, I think this analogy doesn't work either because it misunderstands both mental illness and Calvinism in the deterministic sense here that we're referring to. Okay. Well, let's take a look at the issue of moral awareness. All right. Mentally ill individuals often lack the cognitive ability to distinguish between right and wrong, which again is going to impact moral culpability. All right. But if you contrast this, right, Calvinism affirms that people are morally responsible for their actions because they act voluntarily and knowingly. We think that this is also a biblical, this is grounded in scripture as well. Okay. And another point to keep in mind is God's determination includes rational agency, right? On Calvinism, people reason, they deliberate, they choose, right? There's no loss of cognitive function or moral awareness on the divine determinist perspective, right? The analogy, I think, completely misrepresents what divine determinism entails, okay? And so since mental illness involves cognitive impairment, I think it's a false comparison to God's sovereign determination of human choices because that involves reason, deliberate choosing. Okay. And I'm very well aware of the idea that some people argue that if divine determinism is true, that there's no reason to trust our cognitive faculties, all these sorts of things. I would just disagree that is in fact the case. I disagree that that has been demonstrated. And I think analogies like this that try to show something along those lines don't work. All right. So what's the lesson here? Okay. Analogies against Calvinism, I think, are often question begging. They fail to make crucial differences. And perhaps I failed to make crucial differences here in this video. If I apologize. I am trying my best, right? But I think the most biblical approach is to follow how Jesus used analogies, right? Jesus used analogies in ways that are faithful to divine truths, okay? And he did not misrepresent theological doctrines, okay? His analogies functioned in a way that were themselves consistent with biblical propositions and biblical entailments, so on and so forth. Now, I get it. The other side is going to be claiming to do the same thing as well, and that's why meaningful interaction needs to be had on that level, okay? So, again, what's wrong with these analogies? I think many of the analogies assume their conclusion without proving it, and they do not address, or they ignore, rather, relevant theological distinctions that I think undermine the effectiveness of the analogies in question. All right. So how does this all relate to like apologetics? Kind of bring it down to kind of practical land. Okay. Again, so understanding just in terms of the method of evaluating arguments and things like this, I think understanding question begging, the proper definition of free will, the distinctions between categorical and conditional abilities in this debate, right? I think these are crucial in having the ability to make those distinctions, okay? Particularly when you're defending the coherence of Christian theism in general, or Calvinism more specifically, against objections that claim to undermine, our position. In this context, we're talking more about critiques of Calvinism per se. But this also relates to some other apologetic issues, which is often brought up by the non-Calvinists, that something along the lines that Calvinism, if true, makes God the author of sin. This thing comes up quite a bit, right? It's actually kind of the standard thing that often comes up. And so many objections to Calvinism, I think, assume incompatibilism, okay, without sufficient argumentation, okay? Critics will claim, for example, that if God determines human choices, then humans cannot be responsible, or that true moral agency requires, quote unquote, libertarian free will. Sometimes they won't mention libertarian. In the more layperson interaction, they'll just say freedom, right? But we want to make sure we understand what they mean by that. And so, again, these can beg the question. They assume the incompatibilist position without demonstrating it. And so we want to be able to bring those out. And practicing the ability to identify question begging and fallacies, I think, has great import for just doing apologetics, since logic is very important in interacting with other worldviews and things like this, okay? And so, by recognizing these points, right, we can challenge the underlying assumption of our interlocutor, right? Rather than being forced into the defensive position, right? We can try defending Calvinism against an assumed standard, right? Ask for those standards to be to have justification provided for them. So here are a couple of things we could ask when someone brings these issues before us. Okay, number one, why should moral responsibility require something like a categorical ability to do otherwise if the non-Calvinist is asking these questions, right? Number two, how does Scripture define moral agency, right? Think in terms of biblical categories, okay? Or we could ask if God's decree ensures that human actions are carried out voluntarily and in accordance with their desires, how is this different from everyday moral responsibility? So these are the kinds of questions that we could ask. We're not necessarily always obligated to like be on the defensive. I mean, ask people to justify the assumptions that lie behind their questions. All right. And this is relevant of the issue of whether God is the author of sin on Calvinism, right? So one of the most common objections against divine determinism, that particular understanding of the Calvinistic framework there, is the claim that it makes God the author of sin. Okay, but I think an important thing to keep in mind with this phrase, because it's often bantied around in various contexts, I think the phrase is often used without precise definition and explication, right? Which often leads to a misleading accusation against the Calvinist position. Okay, and so to address this, I think we need to clarify what we mean, or what the person asserting this means by the author of sin. If this means that God is the direct cause of sin, in the same way a human agent, for example, is responsible for, his own sinful actions, then of course the Calvinist is going to reject this outright, right? But if it means that God, by his eternal decree, has ordained that sin occurs from his own purposes without himself sinning, then this is simply a restatement of our understanding of divine providence and God's decree, rather than kind of an indictment on God's character. I think Jonathan Edwards provides one of the most clearest responses to this charge that I think we can take away. We can take a lot away from his statements here, okay? So he argues that there are senses in which God is not the author of sin, and thus divine determinism doesn't entail the accusation that God is morally culpable for evil. And so he writes here, and this is a direct quote from Jonathan Edwards concerning the divine decrees, quote, "If by the author of sin be meant the sinner," all right, so if we say that God is the author of sin, if what you mean by that is that God is the sinner, the agent, the doer of wickedness, or if author of sin be taken to signify the doer of a wicked thing, or the cause of it in such a sense as to be guilty of the evil of it, doubtless I utterly deny God to be the author of sin. But if by the author of sin is meant the permitter, or not a hinderer of sin, and at the same time a disposer of the state of events in such a manner for wise, holy, and most excellent ends and purposes, then I do not deny that God is the author of sin in that sense, though I dislike and reject the phrase as that which by use and custom is apt to carry another sense. Okay? And so Edwards' explanation, I think, provides two key distinctions that help understand this issue. And this is the issue of the differences between kind of God as an ultimate cause of something and the proximate cause. So ultimate causes, the ultimate cause can be understood thusly. God ordains, and we affirm this from the Calvinist position and the determinist position, God ordains all things, including sinful events, for his own good, his own purposes. However, he does so in a way that does not make him the moral agent committing the sin. Okay, so we affirm that God is the ultimate cause of all things in that sense, okay, but we make a distinction between that and proximate causes, namely the actual sinner carries out the action voluntarily and intentionally, making them morally responsible. And so this distinction, I think, helps us understand how that God is sovereign over all things, including sin, right? This is not a secret. This is something that Calvinists who hold to divine determinism, we affirm this, okay? So he's sovereign over sin without being morally culpable for it. And so just as Joseph's brothers were responsible for their evil actions in Genesis 50, verse 20, yet God ordained it for a greater purpose. And so divine determinism affirms that evil is within God's decree without compromising his righteousness. Okay? Think about it. When humans sin, their intentions are evil. When God ordains that an evil act occurs, his intentions are righteous to bring about a greater good. Okay? And the key point here is that when we say that when God ordains that an evil act occurs, God's ordaining that that evil act occurs is not to say that the evil act that God ordained to occur is itself a good act. It only means that God ordained the genuinely evil act to accomplish his genuinely good purposes. And so there is a distinction between the evil action, okay, and the evil intentions that are related to that evil action and God's good purposes in ordaining those things to occur. Okay, so for example, in Acts chapter 2, verse 23, we're told that Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, yet he was crucified by the hands of lawless men. And so the same event is both divinely ordained and freely carried out by sinful agents. And so divine determinism does not make God the author of sin in the blameworthy sense, right? Because God doesn't act sinfully, sinful agents do. God's decree does not violate human moral responsibility, and God's intentions in ordaining sin are good and holy. And so this means that in apologetics, for example, when the atheist or the Arminian accuses the Calvinist of making God the author of sin, the response by the Calvinist shouldn't be to retreat, but to clarify. Okay? So when addressing objections to divine determinism and the problem of evil, here are some helpful things to keep in mind, right? One, we want to clarify our definitions. What does the critic mean by the author of sin, right? Are they equating God's sovereign decree with moral culpability or anything along those lines? If so, then they're going to need to justify that claim, okay? You also want to expose question begging, right? If they assume that moral responsibility requires, say, a libertarian sense of free will, then they need to argue for that. They don't just get to assume it. Also, we want to use biblical examples, especially when discussing with the fellow Christian, right? The Bible itself affirms that God is sovereignly in control of all things, and it affirms human responsibility. So we want to appeal to certain biblical texts and press for biblical consistency. And that's where kind of the exegesis is going to get, you're going to have an in-depth analysis of who is interpreting the text correctly. And of course, that is a difficult but important aspect of defending what one takes to be biblical truth. Okay. And then we want to make a distinction between the ultimate causes and proximate causes, right? God's decree does not make make him the sinner. Okay. Just as the judge sentencing a criminal does not make the judge guilty of the crime. Okay. There is a distinction, right? So by keeping these principles in mind, the Calvinist can turn the argument around, demonstrating that the issue is not whether God determines all things, but whether the critic can justify their assumption that this makes him blameworthy. If someone is making the claim that there is some incompatibility between, say, divine determinism and moral responsibility and moral praiseworthiness or blameworthiness, then they're the ones that have the burden of proof. Okay. And then, of course, that doesn't mean that we are alleviated of responding. Obviously, we want to respond, but don't feel the need to always carry the weight of their accusation upon your shoulders, right? If they make a claim and they seem to be assuming something that's unproven within that claim, then you want to challenge them to actually demonstrate that claim. Okay. So I think Edwards' insight and scripture itself give the divine determinist, I think, a robust response to the charge that Calvinism makes, the God, the author of sin. And so there are ways that we can respond. So I think the proper understanding of God's decree, free will, moral responsibility is not an obstacle to the Calvinist who affirms divine determinism. I think we have responses to the often used analogies, so on and so forth. So there's a lot here, and obviously I didn't cover everything, but I want to take a couple of questions that often come up, and I want to address them. And I think they're, I think the questions that often come up that sometimes Calvinists who haven't thought about these issues tend to struggle with. I want to kind of address some of those. And so this one, you might be familiar with some of them, right? So first question is, does determinism make our choices no different than being born with blue or brown eyes? Okay. So this question has come up in various contexts, right? But of course, how are we going to respond to this? Right. So I would say that no. Okay. I think this analogy is flawed for a number of reasons. I think it misunderstands the nature of compatibilist free will and moral responsibility, right? If you think about it, the color of one's eyes is not something that involves rational deliberation. It does not involve desires or moral agency, right? It's a passive trait determined by genetics, okay? And of course, ultimately, as the ultimate cause, God ultimately decreed that genetics would function in this capacity to give someone blue or brown eyes, right? But when you contrast this with determinism, right, human choices are not passive occurrences, right, like eye color. But human choices are active, they're volitional, right, and intentional actions that flow from the person's character, right? It flows from their desires, it flows from their reasoning. And so the fact that a person's choices are determined doesn't mean they're made without deliberation, without awareness or intentionality, which are precisely the factors that ground something like moral responsibility. And so I think the error in this analogy is that it conflates necessity with compulsion, right? A determined action is not the same as an action that's forced or devoid of rational engagement, right? Under the divine determinist view, people freely choose according to their strongest desires, meaning that their actions are meaningful expressions of their character, right? Rather than, an arbitrary occurrence, okay? And so comparing determined human choices to something like eye color, okay, I think is a category error. It assumes that being determined means being passively programmed rather than rationally engaging in decision making, which of course we would reject. And so moral responsibility doesn't require a purely random ability to do otherwise, okay? But rather that one's actions are voluntary and intentional, which is precisely what the Calvinist affirms. This is what we affirm, okay? Our choices are rational, okay? And the rationality of our choices is compatible with God determining all things. All right. So those are my thoughts on that question that I've heard in multiple contexts, and hopefully it is useful to folks here. Ryan, that's awkward. When you need water, there's no water, right? We'll finish up soon here. Okay. The second question is a question on irresistible grace. So is irresistible grace like God giving someone a love potion to trick them into loving him? Okay. Now, again, this is kind of a love potion analogy, kind of a coercion analogy type of thing. But again, I think this analogy misrepresents the nature of irresistible grace because it seems to assume that God's grace functions like I mentioned before, like an external force overriding a person's will rather than an internal transformation that renews the heart and inclines the heart towards God. Okay, there's a big difference there. You see, a love potion suggests that a person's affections are artificially manipulated against their true nature, whereas irresistible grace, theologically considered, right, works by changing a person's very nature so that they freely, genuinely desire God. Okay? Before grace, the sinner's heart is spiritually dead, right? This is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. The sinner's heart is hostile to God, Romans 8:7. Enslaved to sin, John 8:34. Okay? But when God grants grace, he doesn't trick the person into loving him, right? He removes their blindness, 2 Corinthians 4:6, softens their heart, Ezekiel 36:26, okay, and enables them to see Christ's beauty and worth, which leads them to respond in love, okay? And so the flaw in the love potion analogy is that it equates transformation with coercion, all right? If a blind person is healed and now delights in seeing the sun, for example, right? They're not being tricked into liking the light, right? Okay. They're experiencing reality as it truly is, right? In the same way, when God regenerates a person, he's not forcing an unwilling heart, but freeing the heart from sin's bondage so that it desires what it was meant for all along. Okay. And so the sinner comes to Christ willingly on this view, joyfully and without coercion in that sense that the analogy is trying to give, not because some artificial manipulation, but because their eyes have been opened to see the surpassing worth of Christ. And so irresistible grace is not God bypassing or violating the will, but rather restoring and renewing it so that it truly and freely loves him. Now, of course, God does not do this for everyone. He does it for his elect, and that is another issue, okay? But just to kind of throw that in there, it's kind of a broader discussion, okay? Now, the third point here is based upon a quotation that apparently came from, I believe, C.S. Lewis, okay? And so someone is asking to respond to this. So here is the quote. I don't know the source, but maybe someone could find it. It says here, quote, "Why then did God give them free will?" I would assume give human beings free will. "Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. So that is apparently from C.S. Lewis. Now, um, to share my thoughts here, C.S. Lewis's point here, I think, assumes, or I mean, maybe he argues somewhere else, but it seems to just to take the statement itself, it assumes that genuine love requires what I would imagine he's assuming libertarian free will. I mean, C.S. Lewis wasn't a Calvinist, right? He didn't affirm divine determinism to my knowledge, right? So that in other words, um, for love to be meaningful, the one who loves must have the ability to choose otherwise. Okay? So let me read this quote again here. So, why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. Okay? So, this seems to assume that genuine love requires the ability to not love. I think I've got it. Okay? But I don't. I don't know if that's true. Again, this isn't a self-evident point. If I think about it, and I think it's demonstrably false if I think about it. So if love must freely be chosen in this kind of libertarian sense, which I would imagine that's how he's coming from, right? Then we would have to conclude that Jesus Christ, as the second person of the Trinity, right? The Son loves the Father. But if true love requires that someone has the ability to reject, then it's not true love. Then that seems to entail that the love that the Son has for the Father is not a true love, because the Son cannot not love the Father, if that makes sense. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So I don't think no Christian is going to want to affirm that, right? I think we're not going to say that because the Son cannot fail to love the Father, that therefore the Son is forced to love the Father, or his love for the Father is, insincere, or the second person of the Trinity loves the Father in kind of like a robotic sense or something like that. But rather, we're going to want to affirm that the love that the Son has for the Father, and vice versa, you have the inter-Trinitarian relationship, is of the highest order, right? It's the most perfect expression of love. How can we not affirm that, right? And so the necessity of Christ's love for the Father, I don't think diminishes the purity, the depth, or the worth, right, of that love. Okay, and I think this would undercut that idea that love requires this kind of ability to not love, right? So the idea that love must be freely rejected, or you have to be able to freely reject it in order for it to be real, I think imposes kind of a standard rooted in human assumptions. I think that there's where you get the conflation between the creator-creature distinction. So I don't think that's that's a good point at all, right? The ability to reject love, I don't think is what defines its authenticity, right? Love is most meaningful when it springs from a heart that sees and delights in the worth of its object, which is precisely what God does when he renews the hearts of his people. So I don't think that's a good, I wouldn't agree with that statement. Yeah. Well, I hope that's helpful. That's the last question here, before I lose my voice. Okay. So anyway, I think I'm sinking am I sinking in my chair? Did I become shorter from when I first started? I do apologize. Well, I mean, there you have it. Okay. So again, this is a very, very, broad discussion, a very in-depth discussion. Again, I don't pretend to have addressed every issue, but these are my thoughts as to how we are to interact with analogies that are used to critique the Calvinist perspective, specifically with respect to the affirmation of divine determinism. All right. Well, if folks are interested in a deeper discussion, again, I highly recommend the book by Guillaume Bignon, which is, and I always, if he ever sees this, he's going to be like, how did you forget the book? The book is called Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, a Calvinist Assessment of Determinism, Moral Responsibility, and Divine Involvement in Evil. Okay. And it's part of the Princeton Theological Monograph series. Okay. So highly recommend folks check that out. There's some other great books as well, but I don't remember their titles. There's a lot of books out there that focus kind of like on the philosophical aspect, the biblical aspect, theological aspect. Obviously, this is a terribly deep topic that touches on all those areas of theology, philosophy, and all that kind of stuff. So I hope this was somewhat helpful. There's obviously more to be said. This isn't this isn't like the definitive end all of these sorts of discussions. But these are just my thoughts. I hope that they are helpful as I've thought about these things quite a bit. And I'm sure there is plenty of room for improvement in terms of how I can understand it. But at the end of the day, I understand that there is great disagreement here. And so I would encourage Christians to engage with these discussions with gentleness and respect for the desire of reaching truth. And so press the other side if necessary, answer the pressure of the other side if necessary, but do so in a way that honors Christ. All right. All right. Well, I hope that this is helpful. And I apologize for not Guillaume, I'm so sorry, man. I keep forgetting the name of your book, but nevertheless, that's all I've got for this episode, guys. Until next time, take care and God bless. And before I leave, if you have a list of books that you think are the best defenses of divine determinism and, Calvinism, put them in the comments. And if you have a list of books that you think are the best defenses of kind of the libertarian view and the libertarian understanding of these, put those in the comments as well. I think that'd be a great resource for folks to check out if they're kind of wanting to dive deep into these very philosophically and theologically and biblically deep waters. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much for your time, guys. Until next time, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.